New reaction today to the Justice Department's decision to reject South Carolina's voter ID law. It requires residents of the state to show one of 5 different forms of identification at the polls. Any one will do. They can use a driver's license, a state-issued ID card, a U.S. military ID, a U.S. passport, or a South Carolina voter registration card with a photo. Former South Carolina governor and Fox News contributor Mark Sanford weighed in on the controversy this morning on Fox and Friends.
The law specifically exempts people for religious reasons who don't want a photograph taken. It exempts absentee ballots, exempts people with physical disabilities. And Chip Campson, who sponsored the bill on the Senate side, actually modeled this bill after the Indiana bill that has been upheld by the Supreme Court. So, again, I don't think it's any particular hardship.
So then why is the Justice Department rejecting it? Joining me now, syndicated radio talk show host Leslie Marshall and Lars Larson. Leslie is a Fox News contributor as well. And that's the question, Lars. Let me start with you. If this law is modeled after the Indiana law, which has already been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, then why is the Department of Justice challenging this? And we should tell our viewers they're allowed to challenge or reject certain laws like this in certain states, given the history of discrimination in those states. And South Carolina happens to be one of them. Go ahead, Lars.
Megyn, the logic is kind of weird because they'll say that black Americans are less likely to have these forms of IDs than, say, white Americans, and so therefore they're in greater proportion not likely to be qualified to vote. The fact is that we found out during the Florida election debacle in 2000, you have the opportunity to vote, but you may have to put out some effort. You have to go to the polls. You have to get registered. In this case, simply providing ID is not an unreasonable requirement. And the fact that, for instance, more black Americans may not be literate than white Americans, does that mean that we're breaking the law when we print ballots in the English language? Because there will be some Americans who are incapable of reading that ballot. It's a weird, perverse logic that only the Obama administration could come up with. You know what seems strange to me, Leslie, is that the current law in South Carolina is not that easy already. It already requires certain forms of ID. In fact, it allows... It requires a state-issued or military photo identification or some other photo identification. It seems like the only thing they're adding now is that you can no longer use your printed voter registration card. You have to have a voter registration card with a photo on it. Is that such a big deal that the DOJ needs to step in to stop the change?
Yes, because they are not, the state of South Carolina has not presented any evidence of whether in-person impersonation or any kind of voter fraud. There's no reason for them to add to the current law of 1998, and the addition of the ID does affect, Lars, you might say, you know, some, when you're talking 20% of people of color, specifically African Americans compared to whites who lack the ID from the DMV, when you're talking about the elderly, when you're talking about people who are going to be left out, well, to me, this is going back before 1964. I mean, remember, the Civil Rights Act specifically is in place so that we don't have things like this, that we don't have any disparity toward people of color, toward minorities when it comes to voter rights registration and application.
Lars, does South Carolina need to prove that it has a voter fraud problem in order to pass a law requiring more stringent photo identification when you register to vote?
I don't think they need to, because in modern society there are many things that you have to prove your identity: to cash a check, to open a bank account, to rent a car, to board an airplane. Now, do you have to prove that there might be a lot of people trying to board airplanes that are using false names to be able to say we have to have that requirement? To have that kind of minor requirement to be able to vote seems not to be racially discriminatory any more than it is, as I said, to print ballots in the English language instead of putting pictures of candidates on there for people who are illiterate. You could make the argument that there are more people of color in this country who are illiterate than whites, but it still means, Leslie, that there are whites out there who also have not bothered to obtain a driver's license. It's not the state's job to make it so easy to vote that you don't have to do anything. There has to be, you have to put out the effort to go to the polls. You have to put out the effort to register and all those other things. Providing ID seems perfectly reasonable in this case.
Do you think, is this about politics for the DOJ? I mean, certainly, Leslie, the administration would like to see, typically, Democrats want to make the voter registration process as easy as possible, and Republicans worry about voter fraud, and we see this every election contest. But do you think that there's a political motivation on behalf of the DOJ here, Leslie?
No, I don't, because South Carolina is not the only state. The NAACP did bring this to the Department of Justice, department's attention, and quite frankly, this is their job. I mean, regardless if it's a Democrat or Republican in office, I don't want any American to have hardship or be prevented from voting, quite frankly, even if there's somebody who's not voting for the candidate I'm voting for.
Well, usually they get a provisional ballot. They don't get rejected altogether. They get a provisional ballot. But the reason I ask, Lars, is because one of the arguments that the civil rights groups like the NAACP raised in challenging this law was they said, look, a lot of African-American folks may not have the means to pay for documentation to get state-issued IDs, but then the Justice Department acknowledged that South Carolina is going to give them away for free.
Well, and that's the crazy thing. To say that it has to do with cost, well, then you can make the argument that if somebody has to travel to the polling place, that may take a car trip or a bus trip, that costs money. It takes time and effort to go to register if you're going to register in person. Those are specious arguments. And Leslie, to turn your argument around, you don't want anybody to be unjustly denied the right to vote. How about this? Do you want anybody to vote who's not qualified to vote, who's not registered, who can't prove who they are, who can't even prove that they're in the country legally?
And I'll give you the last word on that one, Leslie.
No, I don't, Lars, but the 1998 legislation that is in place in the state of South Carolina accomplishes that. They don't need to take this additional step. And if they did, if they're so confident that they need to take this additional step, they can prove and appeal the voter fraud that they did not submit originally with this legislation.
Well, you can bet we're going to have this discussion going forward, because the South Carolina is one of 7 states with voter ID laws signed into law in 2011. And it's not the only law, the only state that the Justice Department is looking at. Panel, thank you both so much. Leslie and Lars, all the best.
Thank you, Megyn.
Happy New Year.
And to you.
Happy New Year.